Welcome back, class. I'm excited to jump back into American Revolution with you. Today we're covering Chapter 8. And those that are watching this today on Friday, way to be on track. Those that are watching it ahead, good job. And those that are watching it maybe a little bit behind, that's all good. You're doing great. Keep it up. And we will continue to have a great quarter. Before we jump into Parliament Stumbles again, I just want to remind you that I am doing all recorded lessons right now. I do have a baby boy on his way, and maybe he's here today, but who knows. And I also want to do these recorded lessons because I wanted to have more open office hour times and be able to have a set schedule where I will cover a specific subject on a certain day. So if you have questions about math, for instance, you can come in on, let's say, a Tuesday or something, whenever I have that schedule, and I can work with all those that have questions about math, or maybe Friday will be history or something. I have to set those up, but just be on the lookout in Canvas or email on message about when those open office hours for those specific subjects will be happening, so that if you do have questions, you know when you can jump in. Before we get into Chapter 8, let's review what we learned about in Chapter 7. We talked about the Stamp Act. I know some of you guys probably said it a little bit quicker than I did. Good job. We talked about how the colonists were upset that that members in Parliament, over in Europe, were setting a tax on something that the colonists didn't really have any say in, didn't have any representation. Remember, taxation without representation. They were upset about that. We learned about a man named Patrick Henry and how he spoke some great words and got the colonists to boycott the Stamp Act. Remember, boycotting is to not participate or do business with someone, whether with goods. And so the colonists were boycotting all of British goods, especially cloth. And the British cloth makers were upset. They were losing money. And so the Parliament repealed the act. And so that's where we left off. And so now we're going to jump into Chapter 8. Parliament stumbles again. So it looks like Parliament's going to make a mistake. So, just making sure I'm not missing anything right now. Okay, we're good. So let's call attention to the big question. Why did the British government repeal the Townshend Acts? All right, so we're going to learn about the Townshend Acts and why did the British government repeal them. Remember, to take them back. Maybe they boycotted again. Maybe they, stood up. We'll see. All right, so let's start reading and follow along with me. Who is in charge? You might think Parliament would get the message. No taxation without representation. The colonists had drawn the line there, but the British government still needed money, and it needed to show who was boss. So the British government wanted to show, hey, we're in charge. And so in 1767, just 1 year after repealing the Stamp Act, Parliament tried again, this time as part of the Townshend Acts. It placed taxes on glass, paint, lead, paper, and a number of other goods that the colonists imported. They're trying to tax those things that are coming from different countries. And they've added even more. The Stamp Act was all things that were printed, and now they're doing paper, glass, paint, lead, and a number of other goods. So it didn't work with one kind of good. Let's try to do it with more. Doesn't really make sense, right? Let's look at this picture. Let's see, these are ships probably importing goods. Yep, the British government taxed important goods that the colonists needed. So, food, clothing, glass, paint, those things were being imported. All right. Did I miss any vocabulary words? No, I didn't. Just making sure we're not missing anything. This was Parliament's thinking. The colonists needed these goods, so when ships delivered them to the colonial harbors, our officials will be there to collect the tax. All right, let's pause. A harbor, some of you guys already know what that is, but let's read the definition together. A part of a body of water that is next to land and provides a safe place for ships to anchor. We've been learning in Johnny Tremaine how their silversmith shop was close to the harbor. He would hear and see the ships coming in and goods going in on and off ships. So a harbor is a safe place that ships can come in and dock. Parliament made things worse by saying that whomever was arrested for not paying the tax would be tried without a jury. They're taking away the rights of the Englishmen. Taxation without representation again, and this time trial without a jury? So much for the rights of Englishmen. Once again, the Sons of Liberty swung into action. They organized another boycott of all British goods. This boycott was as successful as the first one. The colonists didn't stop at making their own cloth. They also made their own paint, lead, glass, and paper. The quality of the homemade items was not as good as those purchased from Britain, and it may have cost more to make them, but the colonists would make do to get their point across. So the colonists were like, we need these goods, but we're not going to pay this tax. It's not fair. Taxation without representation, we're not going to stand for it. And so it might have cost to make these goods, but they wanted to make a point, and so they went on making their own goods. The boycott lasted for nearly 3 years. So unlike the Stamp Act that was repealed after 1 year of being put into place, this took 3 years of a boycott. Once again, the colonists succeeded. British merchants and manufacturers lost so much money because of the boycott that they demanded that the Parliament repeal the new taxes. So a manufacturer is a person or company that makes or produces an item to be sold. So there's shoe manufacturers today, there's clothes manufacturers, all different kinds of manufacturers, car manufacturers. It was one thing for the colonists to demand that Parliament repeal a tax. Parliament could ignore them if it wished, but Parliament could hardly ignore the powerful businessmen of their own country. So Parliament didn't repeal the tax because of the boycott, right? They were going on for nearly 3 years. Parliament repealed it because of those British companies and business people that were losing so much money, had so much influence on Parliament. So that's why they repealed it. So in 1770, Parliament repealed all but one of the taxes. The British government kept the tax on tea as a symbol of their right to pass laws and tax the colonies. The colonists responded accordingly. They ended their boycott of all goods from Britain except for one. Can you guess which item they continued to boycott? So if they repealed their boycott on all goods, but British government kept one tax on teas, what boycott do you think they continued? Yeah, let's see. Parliament had left the tax on tea to show that it had the right to tax the colonists. The colonists continued the boycott on tea to show that Parliament did not have the right to tax them. Each side was willing to leave it at that for the time being. The colonists, who were big tea drinkers, didn't give up tea completely. They simply bought their tea from Dutch merchants who smuggled it in the colonies. So smuggling is kind of going under the radar, bringing it in without permission. So that's how those that wanted to drink tea got their tea. The Boston Massacre. Meanwhile, more British troops arrived in the colonies. The colonists grew alarmed. For them, the presence of British soldiers represented a threat to their freedom. The British said the soldiers were needed to defend the colonists against Native American attacks. If that were true, then why weren't the soldiers on the frontier where the Native Americans were? Remember we talked about the frontier, how the colonies were kind of spreading west, and the border between where the colonies were settled and Native American lands, or I can't think of the word. Sorry guys, land or areas that weren't explored yet, that was the frontier. So why were so many troops located in eastern cities, right? The frontier was west, eastern, like Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. In Boston in particular, troops seemed to be everywhere on the street corners, in front of buildings, in the parks. The citizens of Boston jeered at the soldiers. They made fun of them. They tried to make their lives miserable because British soldiers sometimes had regular jobs. Tensions grew over employment opportunities, too. In several cities, fights broke out between colonists and soldiers. Those fights were not nearly as bad, though, as what happened in Boston on the evening of March 5th, 1770. There, a crowd of men and boys gathered around a lone British soldier on guard duty. They shouted insults and threw snowballs at him. Some of the snowballs had rocks inside of them. That would hurt. The frightened soldier called for help. More British soldiers arrived. The crowd grew larger. The shouts, the dares, and the insults grew louder and angrier. Then, for reasons that are unclear, the soldiers turned their guns on the angry crowd and shot. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead or wounded. Their blood stained the snow-covered street. One of them was Crispus Attucks, who had once been enslaved and now worked as a sailor. Crispus Attucks was the first African American to die for the cause of American liberty. So right here, Crispus Attucks was the first African American to die for the patriotic cause. He was not the last. A few days later, more than half of the population of Boston turned out for a funeral march for the dead men. Shops were closed. Church bells rang. Angry Bostonians called the killing a massacre. So a massacre is the violent killing of defenseless people. So people that couldn't really fight for themselves. They might have been shouting or, arguing, but they didn't have guns. They weren't there to defend themselves. The British soldiers had guns. A needless killing of defenseless people. The event became known as the Boston Massacre. A Boston silversmith named Paul Revere made a copper engraving that showed soldiers on a group of perfectly peaceful, innocent citizens. So a silversmith, we're learning about this in Johnny Tremaine, a person who makes things out of silver. In an engraving, something we're also learning, a design or pattern that is cut into the surface of an object. So Paul Revere made this thing out of silver, kind of representing what happened. That is exactly what Revere did. No one knows for sure whether Revere actually saw the shooting. Some of the things shown in the engraving are not true, but Paul Revere was a son of liberty. He made that engraving because he wanted to make people angry at the British. Sure, the citizens who were shot had been asking for trouble, but they certainly did not deserve to die. The British soldiers who fired on the crowd were tried by a local court. It found 6 soldiers innocent and 2 guilty of manslaughter. The lawyer who defended them was John Adams. All right. Parliament and the British soldiers stumbled again. All right. The big question. So those that want some help with the big question, we're going to go through some points. So why did the British government repeal the Townshend Acts? All right. We talked about the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. What did they do to get Parliament to listen? Actually, what do they do to get the businessmen and the companies and manufacturers and British to listen and to stand up to the Parliament? What happened? What did they do? So the boycott had a significant impact on British manufacturers, right? Because what? What was happening to them? Why did it have such a big impact? And because it had this certain impact, they stood up to the Parliament to repeal the act. And so those are some hints and points that you should cover in your big question answer. Remember to do your big question, also your chapter vocabulary. Please use the vocabulary definitions in the book so I know that you're getting in the book. Don't copy and paste a definition from Google. And I will see you guys in the next lesson. See ya.